Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to episode 9 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're going to be talking about Activision. Now if you've never heard of Activision, Activision's been around since, the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. And by dinosaurs, I mean one of these. Why does everything from the 70s smell like grandma's house? By grandma's house I meant not your grandma's house, someone else's grandma's house. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Activision. Like I said, this company's been around for quite some time. It is a major staple in the video game community. As we know, at the industry, the community, many of our childhoods revolved around games that Activision or their merger, their inevitable merger, would create. And in its own way, it kind of created some weird little subcultures. Some people liked World of Warcraft, some people like Call of Duty, some people enjoy Tony Hawk Pro Skater, some people really liked MechWarrior. So I feel that Activision, just from looking from the outside in, contributed heavily to many different sub-communities in gaming, and that is a powerful thing. But I'm not going to be talking about it alone. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to be talking at all, because during the creation of this video, I was sick as fuck. But fear not. The first guest speaker is Ace Gaming LPs, which is a Canadian streamer. That's right, Canada's here this time. All three of the guest speakers are actually Canadian. But like I said, the first one's Ace Gaming LPs, who's a retro variety streamer. Kind of plays whatever you want. It's been a while since he's streamed. When people get busy, I get busy. Even some of the greatest streamers get busy. But if he's online, definitely check him out because he's fucking awesome. Next up is Cilia. Cilia is a streamer or former streamer. I don't know what she's doing, but I do know that she's a lovely person who has been by my side for many months making these episodes. And unfortunately, she has left the team to go pursue other creative endeavors. And we want to send all the love and energy that we can her way so that she continues to kick ass at Overwatch, which I continue to suck ass at. The final guest speaker is Sick Jake, the laid back, cool dad of retro. He reminds me of his fucking dad. All three of these streamers are major fans of my fuck straw. But anyway, that's enough out of me. Sit back, relax, and enjoy some of the history of Activision.
Activision. Now this is a household name. You may have seen it just recently. Maybe you just only know them from the merger. But if you're like me, you remember them from the very beginning. But where did it begin? Well, in 1979, Atari was a household name dominating the game scene. In terms of video games, we didn't have much. Sure, we had the Fairchild Channel F, the Magnavox Odyssey 1 and 2, and the Intellivision was being tested. But ultimately, Atari ruled the 70s. But we aren't here to talk about Atari, after all. We could do an entire episode talking about the corporate handoff that was Atari. Now, this year Atari was sold to Warner Communications, a first of many when it comes to the company being sold and resold over the years. After the transaction, Nolan Bushnell, the creator of Atari and ironically the Chuck E. Cheese franchise, decided it was time to go. Atari was rough on their programmers, and their leadership was cruel. 4 specific individuals from Atari noticed this, namely David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead. They pretty much had a powwow and said, fuck it, and left to form their own company. A company that would later be known as the third-party developer, Activision. But starting a company costs money. While it might be easy for some people to start a company in a garage, they still have to have some sort of capital to go along with it. This is where the Fantastic Four met up with an attorney by the name of Jim Levy, who was already raising money to make cassette tapes for home computers. So ideally, he was the perfect person for all the separating members of Atari to entrust with this new type of an independent game development company. Levy was brought on board as the CEO, and well, it's time to create a name. The first take was VSync, but Levy was afraid that people might not understand how to pronounce it. So they settled with Computer Arts Inc. for legal purposes. After some brainstorming, it was decided to change the name to a combination of active and television, leading to the name Activision. Sounds cool, right?
Hey, you! Stop!
Uh-oh. Ray Kasser doesn't like this new Activision company.
You know too much.
Yeah, Kasser wanted to sue Activision because they knew trade secrets. Or stole them. Well, technically they did. They understood how to make games a certain way for a certain system. So let's create something known as a third-party developer. That sounds nice. And that's what happened. Paying royalties to a certain company, a company would then be able to develop games without being owned by that company. And that is what brought Activision to fame. Activision was set to begin creating games. After all, they knew how to make them, and they knew how to program for a specific console, the Atari 2600. The long short, Atari knew what to do and how to do it, and they did it well, starting with the 1982 hit Pitfall. This game was the first game created by Activision and sold well over 4 million copies, leading to growth for Activision from a humble team of 4 to 60 people. This led to stock options and set the framework for other companies to enter the third-party development concept. From the early 1980s, Activision was pumping out tons of Atari 2600 games that were all staples of the Atari generation. Games such as Boxing, Barnstorming, Chopper Command, Star Master, Spider Fighter, Decathlon, and tons of others. If you have any amount of Atari 2600 games, then more than likely you have an Activision game. Much like how you probably already have 2 or 3 Acclaim influenced games if you have any decent sized collection. Wait, what's happening? What? Nah, shit. Atari's gone and fucked up everything. At least, that's what people always say.
But let's set that straight. It's time for the video game crash of 1983, perhaps the darkest time in video game history. Here's how it went down. In the beginning, there was one console, the Magnavox Odyssey, and they introduced Pong, which is fine and dandy, but then other people wanted to make Pong, and it was a fucking Pong orgy. And by the time the second generation of gaming came out around 1976 to 1992, everyone was making their own consoles and trying to stick their hand in the pot. This led to heavy flooding and saturation of the console market. This led to supply and demand issues. Companies were pumping games out left and right to try and match this request, and some of the consoles had their own independent libraries, which caused even more issues. Another key factor was that in the 80s, home computers were very much a thing, and they were kicking ass, such as the Sinclair ZX81. And these computers were simply faster. Texas Instruments and Commodore started fluctuating their prices to beat each other out, and the home consoles of that generation were left fighting to survive. Then, the market began to slowly inflate, and companies began making a metric fuckton of games for the 2600. Companies such as Magic, Games by Apollo, CBS Video Games, Mattel, MCA Incorporated, Fox Video Games, and eventually, because of how many people were creating these games, they slowly lost their worth, and inevitably, the market crashed. Stores couldn't stock the games, and in the same breath, people simply weren't buying them. That led to games being marked down to almost 80% of their original value. Magnavox and Magic pulled out of the video game market, and arcades around America started to shut down. Sales of video games went from 3.2 billion to roughly 100 million. Nintendo's Hiroshi Yamauchi described it the best by saying, "Atari collapsed because they gave too much freedom to third-party developers, and the market was swamped with rubbish games." And that fact alone led to Nintendo creating the seal of quality that let them survive the leap through the crash. But what was Activision doing during all of this? Well, they figured out that to save money during this turbulent time, it would be wise to not exclusively create games for the Atari 2600, a move that likely saved them from the fates of many other companies during that time. They developed games for the Commodore 64, the Apple computer family, as well as the 8-bit family of Atari. But there were some administrative troubles as well. With the situation being very unpredictable, key members of Activision made very specific choices that would define their direction in the video game industry. Larry Kaplan decided to leave Activision to return to Atari to focus on hardware development, while Bob Whitehead and Alan Miller decided to break free of Activision and create their own company, Accolade. But David Crane and CEO Jim Levy weren't done trying to keep the idea of Activision afloat, despite the leaving of other founding members. And to gain traction after the crash, they acquired Infocom, and that move likely resulted in Levy being replaced by Bruce Davis on the board. Crane and Davis did not see eye to eye, After all, during the crash, Davis closed Imagic, meaning he had given up in some capacity, and Crane felt that Davis was piggybacking on the success of Activision. After years of issues administratively, Crane left Activision to form Absolute Entertainment with Gary Kitchen in 1988.
It's the late 80s and the 90s are right around the corner. Activision survived a video game crash and came out a shining company when things could have been far worse. But the thing to do during this time was not only to make games, but also to branch out to very specific things. For example, Acclaim was picking up IPs, absorbing companies, and licensing things such as comics, TV shows, and even making games about movies. This is exactly what Activision did, but in a different way, leading to a name change to Mediagenic that had 4 major aspects. Here they are. The first was obviously Activision, which was still developing games for the NES, SMS, Atari 7800, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and the Amiga. The second was Infocom, which was acquired by Jim Levy before his departure. Infocom was notorious for making interactive fiction games, or text-based adventures such as The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or more famously, Zork. The third aspect was GameStar, which was known for making sports games such as Face Off, but more importantly set the framework for the Madden NFL football series. Finally, we had 10.0, which made business application software. Of all these variances, only 3 would survive, as Infocom just wasn't doing enough for Activision. Another noteworthy accomplishment of this time period was the acquisition of Cyan Worlds, leading to the release of a game called The Manhole, which was the first major CD-ROM game ever released. So, we have all these companies, let's start making money. Or in the case of management under Davis, let's start losing money. This resulted in heavy losses to Activision, and even pushed Cyan to sever their contract with Activision. But luckily, a company by the name of Broderbund was kicking ass, leading to the cult classic Myst in 1993. Davis was on his way out, his leadership was causing the company to lose a lot of money, and the board of trustees started noticing this, and turned their eyes to a man named Bobby Kotick, who at the time was trying to buy out Commodore International, but instead he focused on buying out Activision. So he went for the full suite of Mediagenic, buying them for the low cost of $500,000. This is a big deal because a company with a net worth of millions was bought out for literally $500,000. Kotick was the greatest thing to happen to Activision. He laid off over 90% of the company and he started from scratch. He breathed a breath of fresh air into Infocom, giving them another chance to revitalize the Zork franchise. He turned a negative net growth into an astonishing $40 million increase and renamed Mediagenic back to Activision. He made promises that he would keep, and he accomplished all of them. Activision was back to where they were before, a proud company that was developing and publishing amazing games and setting the standard. In 1989, Activision would create the franchise MechWarrior, being based on FASA's BattleTech, and it was heavily commercially successful, as was the sequel, MechWarrior 2, which sold 500,000 copies in the first 3 months. Tons of fantastic games were created during the 90s, but by the time the late 90s rolled around, Kotick realized that Activision was completely capable of creating their own games, but maybe, just maybe, they could acquire more companies to make more awesome games.
Activision is a hard company to talk about, because for the first time ever, we are talking about a company that developed as well as published games. Now, for the purpose of this episode, we are going to talk about the independent companies that were acquired by Activision in the 90s onward. Then we will be covering franchises by Activision. It'll be a lot of information, so buckle up and enjoy. Let's begin by talking about the active studios that are currently still kicking ass for Activision. Beenox. Beenox was created in 2000 in Quebec City, but originally they only ported games. For example, they ported X-Men, Spider-Man, and Shrek stuff. But the first original game they created was B-Movie Game. Now, before I judge Forty for not putting the in front of the title, what the hell, man? No, it's just called B-Movie Game. Other than that, they made tons of games for the Spider-Man franchise, such as Spider-Man, Friend or Foe, Shattered Dimensions, Edge of Time, you name it, they made it. But when the founder, Dominique Brown, left in 2012, the company has more so been working on supplemental support for Activision projects Call of Duty, as well as Skylanders.
Demonware was created in 2003, but they mostly focus on technical aspects, for example, engines and applications for profile matching and gaming statistics. This currently plays a heavy role in the multiplayer aspect for Call of Duty. Outside that, they don't really do much. High Moon Studios began as a product of Sammy, the people who currently have control of Sega. Their initial entry into the video game world was Dark Watch: Curse of the West, which was a first-person shooter released in 2005. A year later, Vivendi would purchase High Moon and incorporate them with Sierra Entertainment. This would lead to a game practically every year after 2010, starting with Transformers: War for Cybertron, which spawned 2 more sequels. They would also create nifty games such as Deadpool, as well as Call of Duty, Advanced Warfare, and Destiny.
If this company doesn't ring a bell, then you've potentially never played any Call of Duty game. The company has been pumping out Call of Duty games for Activision for years, since 2002, but we aren't getting into it yet. Call of Duty is a major franchise for Activision and will be covered later in this episode. What's important to know is that Activision initially funded Infinity Ward, and a day after Call of Duty was released to critical acclaim, they fully acquired them. The dream team that would create Infinity Ward was Grant Collier, Vince Zampella, and Jason West, but you won't find the latter two walking the halls of Infinity Ward anymore. They were canned for being insubordinate, but they went on to create Respawn Entertainment, known for the Titanfall series, to include Apex Legends. Smart move! Raven Software. Raven Software is one of the older companies that's still kicking in a contemporary setting. They were originally created in 1990 and are mostly known for working with id Software, resulting in games such as Heretic as well as Hexen, and even had hands in for Quake 4. But they made a giant steaming pile of dog shit that was Wolfenstein, and almost got destroyed because of it. In fact, a vast majority of the company was laid off because of Wolfenstein. And then their next project, Singularity, took quite a while to come out. But don't forget some of the earlier works in the 2000s, such as Star Wars Jedi Knight 2, Marvel's Ultimate Alliance, as well as many of the contemporary Call of Duty games. Since the acquisition that occurred in around 1997, many of the employees of this company left to form Human Head Games, who are known for such titles as Rune, Bioshock Infinite, as well as Prey.
Created by Glenn Schofield and Michael Condrey, Sledgehammer Games started their adventure with 2005 game 007 From Russia with Love, with the help of Electronic Arts. This led to the creative power necessary to create one of the greatest survival horror franchises of modern years, Dead Space. But where does Activision come into play? Well, they received the bid to work in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 alongside Infinity Ward, but they would go on to co-develop many other Call of Duty games, such as Advanced Warfare and Call of Duty World War II. Since then, the original members have resigned from Sledgehammer, but they still work with Activision. Apart from being one of the weirdest names for a video game company ever, this company was known for Star Control, which was an accolade game that is basically a primitive space combat game. And by primitive, I mean 1990 primitive. Crystal Dynamics, the company that made Gex, was the driving force for Toys R Bob throughout the 90s. And after a hiatus, they were picked up by Activision. You're probably wondering what the hell they make now, because the company is not one that just rolls off the tongue in conversation. Well, they make Skylanders games. You know, that terrible subplot of Spyro? Yeah. But they did redeem themselves by remastering the original Spyro games in 2018 with Spyro Reignited Trilogy, and they did a pretty damn good job.
Treyarch was created in 1996 by Peter Ackerman and Duan Kuslo. And to be honest, if you knew the original games they created, you would wonder how in the actual fuck did they end up working on so many Call of Duty games. Their first game was released in 1998 called Olympic Hockey Nagano 88, but the most well-known game, if you want to call it that, was Die by the Sword, which was a commercial failure. They made numerous games that were subpar, such as Triple Play the baseball franchise, or various hockey games under the NHL 2K line. They also made Spider-Man. How the hell did Activision pick them up? Well, they were bought out by Activision and probably given a chance to learn how to incorporate proper engines and smoother controls. They were kept alive by an incorporation with Grey Matter Interactive. But to be honest, when they released Call of Duty Big Red 1 in 2005, that was the key that maybe they had something going for them. Since then, they've been a premier name in the Call of Duty franchise. Also, we talked poo-poo about the Spider-Man game, but to be honest, they are really good. Ultimate Spider-Man was one of the greatest Spider-Man games of its time, so check them out.
Based out of New York, Vicarious Visions was created in 1990, 29 years ago. It's so cool to think about the history of some of these companies and how long they've been kicking. Their first game was the 1996 release of Synergist, which was a Dawson point-click game, and it had digital actors, but was only released in Europe. So, an American company exclusively released in Europe? Yikes. But the story is about a journalist called Tim Machine, a play on Time Machine, who is forced to work under shitty circumstances by the newspaper company he works for. Basically, New Aarhus, the city he lives in, is really shitty. Like, they have cutting-edge technology, but in the worst ghettos you can imagine. So basically, it's like Detroit. Basically Detroit. It actually had a competition where if you found out what the game's title meant, you could win a prize. The next game will be Dark Angel, spelled really weirdly, Angael. It's a run-and-gun fantasy game, and it's kind of a sleeper hit for all accounts. Many people enjoyed it, but a lot of people also haven't heard of it. From the 2000s onward, they mostly made Game Boy games, with some games coming out on multiple platforms, such as Polaris Snowcross, as well as Spider-Man 2, Enter Electro. Well, the PS1 version at least. In 2005, they were acquired by Activision, and since then the majority of games still ended up being handheld ports, but they still had some hands in amazing games, such as the non-main series Guitar Hero entries, Doom 3, as well as most of the Skylander games. Oh, they also made the PC version of Destiny 2. But not every company that Activision obtained could stand the test of time, and here they are, starting with the Blast Furnace.
This company started out in 2011 as Activision Leeds, so it really wasn't as much of an acquisition as it was a company created in that locale. Their sole purpose was to create iOS versions of Call of Duty games, so phone-based games. The most recent game they made was called Call of Duty Strike Team. They were later renamed to the Blast Furnace in 2012, and they went up in flame, figuratively of course, but closing in March of 2014. Grey Matter Entertainment began as Zatrix Entertainment in 1993. Their first game would be called Siberia in 1994, which is a science fiction adventure game for the PC, but it was inevitably ported to various consoles at the time, such as the 3DO, Saturn, as well as PS1. It's a hard game to explain, as it has 4 major elements. Sometimes you fly a plane, sometimes you walk around, sometimes you solve puzzles, and sometimes you control a gun turret. It's random, but the graphics were simply impressive for the time. It was hit or miss, but it hit hard enough to generate a sequel with Siberia 2 Resurrection in 1995. Then they released a little game called Redneck Rampage. It's an FPS where you play as redneck brothers Leonard and Bubba in Hickston, Arkansas. You have to save your prize pig, Bessie, and keep the aliens away? This is incredible. This is a cult classic for Grey Matter, and it was good enough to spawn 10 spin-offs and expansions collectively. 10! In 1999, they changed their name officially to Grey Matter and were acquired by Activision in 2002. But before that happened, they released a game known as Return to Castle Wolfenstein. It was meant to be a remake and reboot of the Wolfenstein series, but it was more so known for its multiplayer aspects. It also showed one of the many examples where id Software and Activision had a blossoming relationship, as this game used the id Tech 3 engine, more commonly known as the Quake 3 engine. In 2004, they would release Call of Duty United Offensive, and the following year would be merged with Treyarch.
Tesseract E here to talk about some Infocom. Infocom is a massive staple for many of us OG gamers. They were created in 1979 and essentially presented the format of text-based adventures to us on a silver platter. Mark Blank and Dave Lebling were two people who fell in love with a game called Colossal Cave Adventure, created by William Crowther and Don Woods, and they cited that game as inspiration for Infocom's first game, Zork: The Underground Empire. Basically, you play as the adventurer in the land of Zork, and you go around finding objects and basically trying to obtain the 20 treasures of Zork, while also attempting to survive against various elements that are out to get you, such as giant cyclops, evil spirits, thieves that move placeholders around on your map, as well as... Uh-oh. The lights went out!
Ah, shit! I was eaten by a grue!
Sporting 28 ways to die, the game was a massive success, and laid out a golden path for all other games that were text-based. Infocom would build its legacy in this genre. Zork 2 and 3 would come out over the next 2 years, leading to the Enchanter trilogy, starting in 1983 with Zork Enchanter, where you play as an enchanter who's going to kill Krill, the evil warlock. It has over 700 words and it's simply amazing. That was followed up by Zork Sorcerer in 1984 and Zork Spellbreaker in 1985, respectively. From this point on, every year on the dot they were making text-based adventures right up to 1989. Infocom was doing fantastic, but they wanted to create something more. Specifically, a database application called Cornerstone. It was meant to integrate with all computers, but at $495 a copy and a difficult learning curve, it didn't last long. Ultimately, it was their games that made them their money. Cornerstone was a major failure, so much so that it caused Infocom to fire 100 of their employees. Activision swooped in and purchased them for $7.5 million, thanks to Jim Levy, the CEO of Activision at the time, loving their games. But that relationship was turbulent at best. The name would be abandoned, and so would Infocom's future. Speaking of the future, we're going to be doing a full episode on the history of Infocom as they practically perfected the text-based adventure. So look forward to some Booze Miller asking us, "Want some rye?"
Of course you do.
Luxaflux, contrary to popular belief, isn't the name of a contemporary rapper. It was a video game company created in 1997 by Peter Morawek and Adrian Stevens, based out of California. They were a tiny company, but their first title is a cult classic for the N64 and PS1, known as Vigilante 8, which, to be honest, was probably the only major competitor to Twisted Metal at the time. You basically play as a number of vigilantes who are going after competing oil companies, such as Omar, or the Oil Monopoly Alliance regime, which, to be honest, is probably the most American thing ever. It plays just like Twisted Metal, and all of the characters have their own endings. And many people say this entry is far better than Twisted Metal 2, which was out at the time. The sequel, Vigilante 8, Second Offense, was released in 1999, and saw release for the Dreamcast in conjunction with the PS1 and N64. We won't spoil anything, but it involves time traveling and fighting against a very close friend. Then they released Star Wars: Demolition, which Forte played the other day.
Yeah, this game was a major part of my childhood. I wasn't allowed to play any T-rated games growing up, unless they were Star Wars games. Don't ask me why. It was just my dad's rule. Basically, in this game, you play as any of around 8 people from the Star Wars universe who are competing in a contest by Jabba the Hutt, and it follows the idea that Luxaflux was known for: vehicular combat. It's clunky, it's raw, and it's fucking hard. But I just recently beat it, and to be honest, it's a good time. The endings come in good and bad forms, and the bad ones scared the shit out of me as a kid.
In 2002, they would be purchased by Activision, who at the time was working on a groundbreaking game by the name of True Crime: Streets of LA, which was an amazing game that was essentially a GTA clone, but in the perspective of a detective Nick Kang. This game had great combat, perfect elements, as well as the opportunity to prevent crimes, which, for the most part, wasn't really a thing. The sequel, True Crime: Streets of New York, was also just as successful. Both games are definitely worth checking out if you get a chance. Fun fact, Sleeping Dogs, the 2002 action-adventure game released by Square Enix, was supposed to be a part of the true crime series, known as True Crime: Streets of Hong Kong. But Activision nixed it, and 2 years prior to Sleeping Dogs being released, Activision nixed Luxoflux, saying it was time for them to go. Don't worry though, Luxoflux went on to create their own company called Isopod Labs.
Shaba Games. Shaba Games was created in 1997 and released their first game in 2000 called Grind Session, which was a competitor to Tony Hawk's Pro Skating, but it wasn't nearly as successful. Most of the games were skating related, and hey, when Activision acquired them in 2002, guess what? They made Tony Hawk's Underground 2 Remix. They also made Czech Super Slam. Yeah, they didn't do too much. That's probably why Activision shut them down in 2009.
Red Octane has an interesting history. They originally started with a site called Web Game Zone, which was the first online video game rental service, way before GameFly or GameTap, if you want to consider GameTap a rental service. And after the success of that, they started making various peripherals for video game consoles, such as dance mats for DDR, joysticks, and other stuff for games that mostly part involved music. Their first game was released in 2004, which was a rhythm game akin to DDR, but the real breakthrough they had was Harmonix in 2005, where they worked together to create the first Guitar Hero game. The game was critically successful and led to 6 more entries in the series. It also had 6 expansions and 5 more spin-offs. We do eventually want to cover music games, so we'll cover this series in depth when that time comes. In 2010, Red Octane was closed by Activision 2 years after the release of Guitar Hero World Tour.
Underground Development. This is a weird company. They contributed as much as Shaba Games, but they made games that were stupid. They started as Z-Axis Limited in 1994 and got their start with Madden NFL 96 for the Sega Genesis. From that point on, they basically made sports games with the exception of a single Space Invaders entry. They were acquired by Activision in 2002 for $20.5 million and made the blockbuster piece of shit known as BMX XXX. Now for those of you who don't know, BMX XXX was a game where clothing was optional. It was also a massive commercial failure. They would release X-Men the official game in 2006 and be renamed Underground Entertainment in February of 2008. And then be shut down in April of the same year. Budcat Creations was created by Jason Anderson and Isaac Burns, who used to work at EA Tiburon, who created a vast majority of the Madden NFL, Tiger Woods, and NCAA football games. 40 used to work at the testing center down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where EA Tiburon QA tested most of their games. In 2000, they would be split to become their own company, but still worked on Madden games for EA. Over time, they would make more games such as NASCAR entries, NHL hockey, and FIFA Manager. But one of their most phenomenal games would be Psychonauts, where they ported it to the PS2. It's crazy, but this game didn't sell well, but it's a must-play game for the PS2. And hey, they even mentioned making a sequel this year, so look for it. Other than that, Budcat was responsible for the porting of many of the late-era Guitar Hero games for the PS2 and the Wii. They would later be shut down in 2010.
7 Studios. 7 Studios. Louis Peterson created this studio in 1999, which made a few games such as Legion, The Legend of Excalibur, which follows the legend of King Arthur and all of the associated goonasses such as Merlin, Morgan Le Fay, Sir Lancelot, you name it, it was part of the game. If you've played Gauntlet, Baldur's Gate, or any Diablo game, you might find comfort in this game, but outside of that, it wasn't that successful. After that, most of the work involved working on licensed games based off movies and TV shows such as Sopranos, Road to Respect, as well as Pirates of the Caribbean, The Legend of Jack Sparrow. They even made a Napoleon Dynamite game. Now, Activision has a shady history with 7 Studios, and it's really kinda fucked up. 7 Studios was working on the game called Scratch, the Ultimate DJ, but Activision was working on DJ Hero, and Activision wanted to acquire them. But what they didn't know, or wanted to gain from the exchange secretly, was that Newmark, the makers of turntables and DJ supplies, were already in contract with 7 Studios. But, oh well, After they acquired 7 studios and released DJ Hero, they canned half of the team, shutting off the possibility for future music games, and shut down the studio 2 years later. What a shit ending.
Bizarre Creations was created in Liverpool, England in 1988, and began as Raising Hell Software, but nobody really dug the word hell in the company's name, namely Sega, Sony, and Psygnosis. So, up until 1994, they essentially went without a name. Their first game would be Combat Crazy for the Commodore 64, but good luck finding anything about it. We believe the game you're watching is the game mentioned, and because of the name issue, it's likely that the names used for the development company isn't the true name. Regardless, this game is really smooth. Like, the animation is simply fantastic. But the game we can talk about is the next game released by Raising Hell called The Killing Game Show, released for the Amiga, Atari ST, as well as the Sega Genesis, and published by EA and Psygnosis, depending on which platform you're playing on. If you've ever played Turrican, you've played this game, because they operate essentially the same way. It's a platformer as well as a shoot 'em up. One thing to note, however, is if you're trying to find this game on the Genesis, you want to look for a game called Fatal Rewind. In the early 1990s, the name change to Bizarre Creations was set in stone, and they went on to create a game called Slaughter, which never came to fruition. But it was enough for Psygnosis to say, "Whoa!" and sign them on for a game called Formula 1. Now, how they went from a game called Slaughter to creating the best-selling game in Europe in 1996 is beyond us, but apparently people really enjoyed it, selling 1.7 million copies. From 2000 onwards, they either released really shitty games or really good games. The shitty being Fur Fighters for the Dreamcast, PS2, and PC, and the good ones being Geometry Wars, which is originally a mini-game found in Project Gotham Racing, which was another powerful series. In 2007, Activision would purchase Bizarre Creations for $107.4 million, giving them the push to release up to 3 more Project Gotham entries before Activision closed the studio. The original members of Bizarre Creations did go on to form a mobile game development company called Hogrocket 2011, but it died a year later. If you didn't know who Radical Entertainment was, then you probably didn't play PS1 quite often. It all started with Distinctive Software, which was a company that made tons of NES ports to DOS over the years, and would eventually become known as EA Canada. But during that time, Ian Wilkinson and Dave Davis were 2 employees of Distinctive that broke away and joined Rory Arms to form Radical Software. Then, Mike Ribeiro, who used to be the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Sega, joined as the CEO. And boom! We have a company. Their first game would be The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends on the NES, which was a THQ Software game. It was basically your run-of-the-mill platformer, as was their next entry, The Terminator, that same year. It's the same style of game, a simple platformer. Then, they created a Game Boy game called The Battle of Olympus, which was an action-adventure akin to Zelda 2.
You play as Orpheus, who is going to save his girlfriend Helene from Hades. You encounter various mythological figures, and the game is essentially the same. But let's work on something totally new, totally off the wall, and totally a gem to NES collectors around the world. Mario is missing. Now, if you've never played this game, I've got one word. Ouija. Just look into his eyes. Notice his stare. See his deathless affixation to the eternal darkness that is the rift between heaven and hell. It's an edutainment game. And honestly, people really didn't like edutainment games. But apparently, if you slap a Mario franchise on the front cover of it, then you're good to go. Mario is Missing basically involves you traveling to find Mario who is missing. You travel around the world, piece together clues to find your brother. Radical Entertainment made the NES port of this game, with the software Toolworks making the SNES version. From that point on, Radical focused on making mostly sports games, but did create another edutainment game known as Mario's Time Machine, which was met with just as much success. Fast forwarding to 1997, some of the members left to create Barking Dog Studios, which was purchased by Take-Two Interactive, which was eventually turned into Rockstar Vancouver. But we'll cover that in the future. Returning back to Radical Entertainment, they would open a subdivision called 369 Interactive, which would create various CSI games for Ubisoft. If you haven't played them, Fort strongly suggests playing them. They are fun, and if you are curious about forensic science, check them out. 2 years later, Radical was approached by Vivendi Universal Entertainment, who was impressed with the work Radical was doing and decided to acquire them. This would lead to games such as The Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction, as well as Scarface, The World Is Yours. But the important aspect is that Vivendi held Sierra, and Sierra decided to say fuck Traveler's Tales and give Radical a chance to create a Crash Bandicoot entry called Crash Tag Team Racing, which was a massive success. This would lead to 2 more entries in the Crash series, called Crash of the Titans and Crash Mind Over Mutant, respectively, which the latter sold as much as the previous 2 combined. Radical was on fire. Now, if you've been paying attention, we talked about Vivendi merging with Activision to form a company called... that's funny. A company called... Guess we aren't ready to talk about that part of the history? Well, I guess we'll continue the story of Radical Entertainment in the next episode of Ready Go Gaming Show.
This studio is short and sweet. They were created by Activision for the sole purpose of creating online services for Call of Duty titles. For example, Call of Duty Elite in 2011. They were closed in 2015. That's it. Just closed.
Neversoft. But Neversoft is a radically different story. Neversoft originally was created by 3 members of Malibu Interactive, previously known as Acme Interactive. They were actively creating games for the 16-bit era, for example, the SNES as well as the Sega Genesis. 3 key people came together to form Neversoft in 1994, Mick West, Joel Jewett, and Chris Ward, of which each had their own particular skill base. One was a CPA, the other was a programmer, and the other was an artist. So they had all the bases covered. Their first game was Skeleton Wars in 1995, which paralleled the release of toys from Playmates, but the game wasn't that successful. In fact, it's rather hard to find any information about it. Fast forward to the next year, and Crystal Dynamics, who is known for Gex as mentioned before, wanted a small development studio to work on a Ghost Rider game, but it was cancelled, and with only the initial game under their belt, they started dwindling down to a team of 12 employees from 20. They did make significant progress towards the Ghost Rider game, but they still kept the shell of it, calling it Big Guns. In 1998, they were almost out of money when Activision swooped down to save the world, who wanted someone to remake Apocalypse. And guess what? They already had all the pieces they needed for Ghost Rider, so they just took that shell of Big Guns and released Apocalypse, which was released to mixed reviews. But it did sell, and that's all that Activision really cares about. But Activision had other ideas. Where Neversoft wasn't too great at running gun games, they might be able to pull off skateboarding a little well. So let's take a major name from professional skateboarding, slime in some of the hottest underground music in the ska genre, and make a skating game. This in turn became Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which was a critical success. That was pretty much their cash cow, releasing about 8 titles from that point on, with the major departure being Gun, a Wild West game where you seek a mystical treasure from an evil baron of industry. When Activision acquired the rights to Guitar Hero, it was time for Neversoft to expand their capabilities, resulting in Guitar Hero 3: Legends of Rock, perhaps one of the greatest Guitar Heroes ever released. Unfortunately, despite the success of the Guitar Hero franchise, they were shut down 20 years later, on the day that they were created. That's fucking metal, but worry not, they are still kicking. But they were merged with Infinity Ward.
Activision acquired a few more studios, but ended up selling them. There are only 4 of them, and none of them are really well known. The first was Winacto Games, which is currently known as Behavior Interactive Chile Limited. But they only made supremely bargain bin games, like Jewel Thief or Sea Life Safari. They also went defunct in 2017. The second company was Freestyle Games Limited, which was known for only one game, B-Boy, in 2008. Activision loved it for some weird reason and brought them in. They worked on DJ Hero and DJ Hero 2, which are both fantastic games. But when Guitar Hero Live was released, they severely fell under the expected sales figures, which led them to being sold to Ubisoft. They're still kicking ass as Ubisoft Leamington, who made Tom Clancy's The Division as well as its sequel. The third company was Swordfish Studios, who made one decent game, Cold Winter, which follows Andrew Sterling, who is a former British Special Forces operative who was jailed in China. You basically go through saving people and try and knock down a bad guy a few pegs. It's incredibly generic. Then they made the dumpster fire that is 50 Cent Blood on Sand, which was only slightly better than the predecessor 50 Cent Bulletproof, which was also a trash game. Activision caught wind of their inability to produce quality games and sold the company to Crytek, who were better known for Time Splitters, as well as the computer overlord Fantasia that is the Crysis series. The final company would be Massive Entertainment, which made a few games such as Ground Control and World in Conflict. Both of these games were real-time strategy entries, and both were really cool, so check them out if you're into that style of gaming. The natural process of them being bought out by Vivendi, and then Vivendi being bought out by Activision, resulted in games such as, well, nothing. They released an expansion for their Ground Control series, and then were sold to Ubisoft.
It's time for us to cover some of the franchises that Activision brought to the forefront of gaming. With over 200 games created, we obviously won't be speaking about every single one of them. For the purpose of the video, we will only be following major franchises. Let's begin. This series is a classic. You can find it pretty much on any shelf at any non-reliable video game store, and in the US, you could definitely find it at Staples, Office Depot, or any place that sold PC software for like $10. It was a simple minigame golf in 3D that was created by Sierra Entertainment, so don't expect much from it. It was simple, it was not that successful, and there's not much to it. It was followed up in 1998, a year later, by 3D Ultra Mini Golf Deluxe, but it was the same exact game, with multiplayer. I don't know about you, but the 90s was a turbulent time for online anything. If you could afford actual internet, and not the 56K-bit fax machine exorcism internet, then you could maybe have played this with a friend. You even had a friend who owned this. This series would be rather quiet until 2006, where Wanako Studios was employed by Sierra Online to make 3D Ultra Mini Golf Adventures, which was far more an arcade game instead of just your run-of-the-mill putt-putt golf, and we believe that it is what made it pseudo-successful compared to other mini-golf games at the time. You could edit maps, even hold tournaments with your friends. The final entry would be 3D Ultra Mini Golf Adventures 2, which was published by Konami. It was a major upgrade and featured 50 fun holes of putt-putt action. I wouldn't hold your breath for another entry in this series.
Staying on the concept of Wanako games, Assault Heroes was an arcade top-down shooter that had tons of options. It was released in 2006, initially only as an Xbox Live Arcade game, but eventually it did get ported. You could control speedboats, ATVs, or run and gun to your heart's content. But it had this silly 2000s vibe to it, but it was a fun game. It did have a sequel in 2008 called Assault Heroes 2, and that was dramatically a facelift of the original game. This one carried over that retro feel with contemporary graphics really well, and because of that, it was successful. Now this one is a classic. Battlezone is a tank game, but you'll likely remember it from the simplicity of it. If you ever played it, you remember the green wireframe visuals and the weird cabinet that contained it. Now granted, this was made by Atari, which brought it to popularity on its own accord, but there was a significant traction courtesy of Activision, who carried it to the PC in 1998. In the game, the basic format was up to be a first-person shooter, real-time strategy, and a tank simulation game, which worked fairly well, as it sold enough to gather $2.78 million for Activision. And that was in conjunction with an N64 port called The Rise of the Black Dogs. There was a few expansions too, such as Battlegrounds, which was a level pack edition, and as well Battlezone: The Red Odyssey.
Oh fuck, god damn it, I knew this was gonna pop up eventually. For those of you who don't know Cabela's, it's basically a hunting store. So rednecks unite with the power of Budweiser, gunpowder, camo, and grizzly long cut, because it's time to talk about the hunting games they spawned out of their asshole. It all began in 1998 with Cabela's Big Game Hunter for the PC. It's exactly what you would think it is, and it was made by Elsinore Multimedia, which eventually would be absorbed by Activision. You hunt various animals from various species, all with real rifles, and to be honest, it was a massive fan service for avid hunters. It was also fucking trash. And to give a little courtesy kiss on the ass, they made an expansion called Special Permit that added new weapons, camps, stands, and animals. Yay. That same year, they would push out Cabela's Big Game Hunter 2, which again was met with critical disapproval. The only people who likely kept this IP afloat were people who enjoyed fucking annihilating half of the animal kingdom from the comfort of their computer chair. Again, it had an expansion. Next year, Cabela's Big Game Hunter 3 was released with 65 stands. Whoa! Stands. It was the exact same game and it had an expansion. That's 3 for 3 for the exact same game every single year. Literally promoting Cabela's gear. It was embarrassing how this model worked and the fact that it worked so well. Big Game Hunter 4, released in 2000, would be the first game that Activision would personally put their stamp of approval on. And despite the basic graphics, it was done really well. If you could see past the monotone of every game, every year... Oh wait. Let's keep that idea in our back pocket. It'll be our secret. Shh. 4 was successful, which paved the way for Cabela's Big Game Hunter 5, as well as Cabela's Big Game Hunter Ultimate Challenge, which was the first game that was ported to a home console in 2004. There's really no point to continue breaking down every single Cabela's game because the Big Game Hunter series was essentially the same thing. Sometimes they would whip out a safari trip, sometimes they made specialty hunts for legendary animals, or sometimes you'd have to sit and wait for ducks. All in all, the Big Game Hunter series yielded 12 games in total.
Then they had some random series such as Outdoor Adventures, Ultimate Deer Hunt, and Grand Slam Hunting, each with 2 games respectively. But the real balls-in-your-face series from this clunky nightmare of games was the Dangerous Hunts series. Dangerous Hunts was perhaps, in our humble opinion, the best approach of what this franchise had to offer. It felt much more like a story-based game, but you had the opportunity to get your shit pushed in by a pissed-off mountain lion. But again, it had story. Oh well. Cabela's did the right thing by appealing to a very exclusive audience, and still to this day kick ass doing it. But they suck. But hey, they made a lot of games that were the same. Let's do a thing. But in World War II. Yeah, let's do World War II. Oh yeah, it's time for Call of Duty. Real talk, these games aren't that bad, but they followed the whole re-release. Think kind of like Madden and everything EA puts out. Oh well, let's get to it. So the whole idea of war-based games was originally, for the most part, and successfully pulled off by DreamWorks Interactive. They were the brainchild behind the Medal of Honor series, a powerhouse franchise that almost exclusively dominated the World War II game-playing field. That was until Call of Duty was released in 2003. Now, bear in mind, Medal of Honor already had 5 games out by this point, and they all kicked ass in their own way. So Infinity Ward had big shoes to fill in a market where the expectation was already there, but they did it well. Instead of you following just one person around tons of missions, they changed the perspective of various characters from different countries and different voices of the war. To be honest, this was almost the best history lesson we could ever receive, while also killing tons of Nazis. It was great. It even won Game of the Year in 2003. In the game, you took the perspective of an American, Private Martin, a Brit, Sergeant Jack Evans, and a Russian, Corporal Alexei Ivanovich Vorovin. Stop, jeez. Ain't nobody got time for Soviet in this episode. With it being so successful, Activision decided to get Grave Matter Interactive to make an expansion called United Offensive, which was fantastic, and added some new missions and characters to the game, as well supported a fairly decent multiplayer facelift. And it won Expansion of the Year. The next entry would be Call of Duty 2, which was created by Infinity Ward again, and took their perspective from 4 different angles: Russia, the US, and then 2 British individuals. Again, without hesitation, people flocked to picking up this game, selling 250,000 units in the first week and 2 million copies by 2008. Overall, this game alone has accounted for 5.9 million sales. Then the game was juggled over to Treyarch, who released Call of Duty 3 and brought all Canada to the party. That's right, Poland, Canada, Britain, and the good old US of A. It was awesome. You could do 24-player team matches and could even battle for ranks, which was really cool to be honest. On the PC spectrum, people loved the artwork, the music, the sound. It was really a great game, and sold 7.2 million copies worldwide. This wouldn't be the final World War II based game, but it was the last PC-only version. Now you're probably wondering, I remember this game on the PS2. Well, yeah, you did, but it wasn't the same game we just talked about. Call of Duty had two major battlefields to contend on, the PC as well as the consoles. So there's a different branch of games that were on the consoles, starting with Call of Duty Finest Hour.
You could play as Private Alexander Sokolov, Edward Carlisle, and Chuck Walker over the 20 missions that were forced in your face. This game was fucking hard, but it was enough to garner $45 million in sales in the US alone. But if you're like Forte, then you think the game was subpar compared to the PC entry. Then, while the PC had Call of Duty 2, the console nerds had Call of Duty 2, Big Red One, which was a fucking awesome game in the early 200s. It didn't age well, but imagine this. You're playing the game and literally experiencing history unfold in front of your eyes before every mission. You watch the History Channel teach you a tidbit about the history of war and what was going on. It was simply a fantastic incorporation and a fantastic idea by Treyarch. After the World War II era, Activision decided to separate themselves from making the games occur in the same era, opting instead for a modern approach to war. This is probably where Medal of Honor and Call of Duty split their focus. And while Call of Duty was preparing to make Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare in 2007, Medal of Honor was still focused on World War II, with their most recent game being Medal of Honor Vanguard, which was, well, we don't talk about Vanguard. But Modern Warfare was definitely the turning point for the Call of Duty series. It introduced a new engine that was phenomenal, featuring a story that took place in 2011, where you're playing as either a Marine or a British commando spreading a little bit of freedom in the Middle East. It was met with critical acclaim, and is oftentimes considered one of the greatest games ever released. And it wasn't just a single-player campaign that kicked ass, the multiplayer did too. This game alone accounted for most, if not all, of the lazy days after school. It was either World of Warcraft, Quake, Halo, or this, and this game stood proudly among them. That same year, they would release another World War II based game for the PSP called Call of Duty Roads to Victory. But as a game for the PSP and the N-Gage, well, it was utter trash. Don't waste your time on it. Well, let's stay covering the World War II period for a second with Call of Duty World at War, which was kind of unexpected given the jump to contemporary. But it was refreshing to have the same style as Modern Warfare, but in a World War II setting, which is something, again, Medal of Honor was lacking. The major improvement for this game alone that brought this game to notoriety and would become a staple in the future entries would be the inclusion of a multiplayer or solo game mode called Nazi Zombies, the ultimate party game. It was simple. While you would start with a shit weapon and work your way up while fighting various waves of enemies, you would also have to repair entry points and strategically use your ammo and explore the map as more enemies swarmed on you. It was a commercial hit!
From this point on, consumers would see a flip-flop between two very specific storylines, the continuation of the Modern Warfare storyline and the introduction of a new storyline called Black Ops. The former was released in 2009 as Modern Warfare 2, which upped the ante for what most of us expected in Modern Warfare 1. But the issue was essentially the plot point was the same plot twist, the same, well, everything. But that didn't keep people from buying the title. It had three very specific modes: Campaign, Multiplayer, and Spec Ops, where you would do scenarios inside the game with specific restrictions and objectives, but it carried a heavy amount of controversy. The first most important controversial moment was in a mission titled No Russian, where you essentially mowed down an entire airport of civilians. Then there were nods towards the Department of Defense policy of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which caused allegations of homophobia. The other big thing was that the language was incorrect in some of the regions that occurred in the game, which led to accusations of racial insensitivity. But despite all this, the game was still massively successful. The other game was called Call of Duty Black Ops, which was a new storyline that centered around the time frame of the Cold War. It was far more linear and followed the experience of a CIA operative, Alex Mason, who was being interrogated to get information about a numbers station. Within 24 hours of the game going live, 5.6 million copies were sold. This means this game alone was one of the highest selling games of all time. That's interesting considering it uses a dilapidated engine that was previously used in World at War, but still held the same success as Modern Warfare 2, which used a newer engine. The next 2 years saw a continuation of both storylines, with Modern Warfare 3 being created by Infinity Ward and Black Ops 2 being created by Treyarch. It was time for a new engine. That's exactly what Activision did for Modern Warfare 3, showcasing the IW 5.0 engine, and continued the storyline from the previous games in the same format, which was to be expected. The campaign was divided into acts, all of which were presented fantastically. The co-op missions were expanded, leading to hours of replayability, and the perk system was streamlined. Additionally, they carried over the special ops to include zombies as well as hordes. Remember how we mentioned Beachhead Studios created Elite? Well, this is the game it was integrated in. It offered statistics tracking, social network integration, as well as monthly DLCs that were given away, but it didn't last long, being shut down 3 years later.
Black Ops 2, released in 2012, continued the story of Alex Mason as well as Frank Woods, who you could also play, both of which are from the previous game. However, the game also jumps between 1980 and 2025 where you play as Mason's son David. It's a mess, but within 24 hours of release, it grossed $500 million fucking dollars. Jesus Christ. By the way, this one has multiple endings depending on the choices made by the protagonist during the game, so make sure you pay attention to get the true ending. We're not going to tell you how to do it, just follow your heart and keep your friends alive. It's 2013 and the PS4 is out. Time to get to work to make another Call of Duty. Ghosts. Well, here's Call of Duty Ghosts, which was a new idea, which is cool and all. It had new modes, which is fine and dandy, but people slowly started realizing they were being served the exact same game every year with only slight alterations. It had the same concepts, the same art, the same ending, the same everything. In fact, most people played it solely for the multiplayer, which is bad because that's like 50% of your game. They sold less than Black Ops 2, and instead of owning the fact that the game was subpar to the rest, Activision went out of its way to blame the console transition. Yikes. I'm sure the uncertainty caused by the upcoming transition to the 8th generation console was exactly why the game didn't succeed. It's time to call someone new into the fray, namely Sledgehammer Games. They've been making awesome stuff for years now, why not let them take a crack at the COD series? Well, that's exactly what they did in 2014 with Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, which takes place in 2054. It was significantly different from previous entries. The HUD was removed in favor of projections, and there are exo movements which are cool once you figure out how the appropriate times and ways to use them. As well, there were enhanced abilities. It was a cool spin with an even cooler cast, pulling in people like Troy Baker, Bill Paxton, Rose McGowan, and even Bruce Campbell. Oh, and John Malkovich. And even Harry Gregson Williams, the guy who composed the music for Metal Gear, was on board. It also spawned the press F to pay respects meme, which I know you've used before. Black Ops 3 would share the same fate as Ghosts, where people felt it was lacking because of the reused concepts. But the storyline is somewhat new. It takes place in 2065 during the Third Cold War, and yet again you're stopping a terrorist organization as part of the good guys. From this point on, the games were mostly the same. Advanced Warfare was followed by Infinite Warfare, and Black Ops 3 was followed up by Black Ops 4. But the game nobody expected was a 2017 re-return back to the World War II era with COD World War II, which was fucking gorgeous. The story was refreshing because it was returned to where it all began. The simple mechanics with powerful weapons and a beautiful engine to all bring it together. Other than that, the most contemporary game would be a remake of the original Modern Warfare. All in all, with over 15 entries in the series, Call of Duty has been the major cash cow for contemporary Activision. And despite the fact it was repetitive in nature, this franchise has supported a fine community of 12-year-olds telling you that your mom's a bitch, and it also has been a major contender in the esports community.
we aren't going to dive too hard into Crash Bandicoot, because through and through, it is only an Activision brand by purchase. We will likely do an episode about Naughty Dog, and in that episode we will cover Crash Bandicoot all the way from start to the finish. The only time Activision was present was for two most contemporary entries. The first would be Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, which consists of remasters of the first three Crash Bandicoot games from the 1990s, which was a unique reimagining that allowed the developers to do what they wanted to do way back then in a contemporary setting. The second would be CTR, Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, which was created by Beanox and served as a remake of the commercial hit Crash Team Racing, again from the 90s. With 31 tracks, this game was 100% worth it, so definitely spend some energy on it. Now this series was impacted by Activision, and it's hard to explain without explicitly playing it yourself. Imagine Asteroids in the arcade, but with tons of graphical upgrades. It was originally a minigame in a racing title called Project Gotham Racing 2, and it was popular enough to generate its own title in 2003 for the Xbox called Geometry Wars Retro Evolved. The point of the game was simply to survive as long as possible, surviving waves of zany and colorful enemies that go out of their way to try to remove you from the fabric of space and time, literally. The sequel would be called Geometry Wars Waves, and was present in Project Gotham Racing 4 before getting a standalone title release in 2007. It's the same game, but you experience different enemies. Jumping to the Wii and the DS, Geometry Wars Galaxies was released and introduced the concept of multiplayer play. Again, it's the same game. The next entry, Geometry Wars Retro Evolved 2, brought a lot more to the table in terms of gameplay, instead of just the usual modes of play. 6 different modes were introduced. For example, in Deadline, you had 3 minutes and infinite lives to get the highest score that you could muster. In Pacifism, you have 1 life and no ammo, flying through gates to survive. The final game would be Geometry Wars Touch, and it was an iOS game for the phone, so yeah, mobile. All in all, if you want a quirky and fun time waster, look no further than Geometry Wars. It's addictive and fun, yet simple.
Guitar Hero started as a product for Red Octane, which was acquired by Activision. It all started with Guitar Hero on the PS2 in 2005, which was a music game that was played by a controller as well as a badass Gibson SG playing 47 solid rock tracks throughout history. The game itself actually has a pretty awesome history in itself. It all started with Rob Kay. The lead designer of Guitar Hero was inspired by Konami's Guitar Freaks, which was also an arcade game akin to another Konami IP, Drum Mania. Essentially, it was an arcade game where you played music, and it's a great time if you ever go to Japan. Red Octane, as we mentioned earlier, was making peripherals for music games and sought to bring something like Guitar Freaks to the United States. Greg Fishbach, the guy who was in charge of Acclaim, looked over it, because he thought it was a weird idea. This led to Red Octane approaching Harmonix, who were already working on games such as Frequency, Amplitude, and Karaoke Revolution, all music games. They agreed and helped create Guitar Hero. Many of the elements from Harmonix's previous endeavors carried over, such as the gem tracks and power-ups. Combined with Guitar Controller, it was an experience like no other. In 2007, it had sold over 1.53 million copies, winning multiple awards. The sequel would come out a year later and would jump to the Xbox 360 as well. It came with the same guitar, but it was red this time, unless you got the Xbox 360 version, which came with a Gibson Explorer. The game was mostly the same, but with music games, you can get away with repetitive elements provided you change something slightly. This isn't an action-adventure game where you are expected to drastically change elements. And that's what Guitar Hero did. It kept the same framework and either added or enhanced guitar techniques such as hammer-ons, pull-offs, and 3-note chords. The library was also boosted to 64 playable songs and allowed for you to change to multiple real-life guitars. 2007 would bring one of the greatest entries in the Guitar Hero franchise, Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock. In this game you play over 70 songs, most of which weren't covers anymore. They were the real deal. With Neversoft leading the helm, we saw the inclusion of real-life musicians such as Slash, Tom Morello, and other versions even had Bret Michaels of Poison.
The guitar was also a major change, with it being a wireless controller, which obviously was accommodated differently depending on what platform you were playing the game on. And and there was a Guinness World Record created for the highest score on perhaps one of the hardest songs of all time, Dragon Forces Through the Fire and the Flames. If you can beat this on Expert, you are considered a gaming god. Or really lucky. Either way, it's a good time. But not everyone thought it was a good time. Namely Axl Roses of Guns N' Roses, who is kinda pissed that Slash's new band, Velvet Revolver, would be getting exposure, and after Welcome to the Jungle was used in Guitar Hero 3, he sued Activision for $20 million. But it was eventually thrown out. The next entry would be Guitar Hero World Tour, which played very similar to another franchise known as Rock Band, made by Harmonix. In this game, you would be able to play as a band, tour the world, and edit your band members' clothing, trademarks, reactions, and more. The kicker was in Rock Band, you could literally have a rock band, complete with drums, bass tracks, guitar solos, and of course vocals. And up until World Tour, Guitar Hero was exclusively focused on guitar alone. So people noticed that these two games were similar, but they weren't concerned yet. You had Rock Band fans, and you had Guitar Hero fans. And either one would easily jump to the other because the genre is all but exclusive and always a good time. This game alone had 86 songs with the ability to purchase more as DLC, and you could also create your own tracks, which could then be uploaded to the Guitar Hero Tunes service. In 2009, Guitar Hero 5 would be released, and kept the same energy and format as Rock Band World Tour. I see what you did there, Fort. It did add a few new features, such as the ability to drop into someone's jam session, the ability to create any combination of instruments you wanted for your band, and even a Rockfest competitive mode. You could play online, offline, and unlock tons of new stuff courtesy of challenges within the game or by DLC. It also beefed up the amount of celebrities that showed up, having true-to-life models of artists such as Kurt Cobain, Carlos Santana, Matthew Bellamy, or Johnny Cash. It was a great game, but it sold slightly worse, and by slightly, we mean 50% worse than World Tour. Plus, Activision had a hell of a time getting the permission to use Kurt Cobain, who is often regarded as being utterly against any commercialization of his image, and it took almost 3 years to get that permission from the Cobain estate.
The sixth entry in the series would be Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock for all major systems appropriate in 2010, and added a new storyline where the consumer had to recruit 8 band members to destroy the Beast. A story that hilariously enough incorporates the Rush song 2112, and it's narrated by Rush, which was kind of a nice touch. It was a successful game, mostly due in part to Activision bringing in fresh talent after the lackluster sales of the last few games. This led to Red Octane being dissolved, and Neversoft losing their ability to make Guitar Hero games. Unfortunately, this is where the Guitar Hero franchise started slipping into the back burner of Activision's scope of operations. But it wasn't necessarily gone, just not selling as much. Activision decided to bring in freestyle games to try and counteract the negative sales with Guitar Hero Live, but they made some major changes to the game. The first was the controller. A traditional Guitar Hero controller had a strum bar, a few option buttons, and 5 colored fret buttons. And in newer versions, there was a tapping strip. But the Live controller was an anomaly. It had no tap strip. It just had the 6 floating buttons on the end and felt a lot like a Rock Band controller. Another thing that was changed was that instead of you watching an animated model scene in the background, it included these cringy live action scenes. It was like overlaying a music track over a GoPro footage on the stage. They also had this weird-ass music service called GHTV, where you could play on a rotating playlist. Overall, the game was crippled by the concept of microtransactions, but it still sold well, surprisingly. Since then, there hasn't been a single mainline release. But during the time those mainstream games were rocking out with their socks out, Neversoft released a few band-specific titles, such as Guitar Hero Aerosmith, that allowed you to play the life of Aerosmith, from the small-time gigs all the way to the infamous halftime show at Super Bowl 35, and even their induction to the Hall of Fame. It was a refreshing change of pace for the series and sold roughly 25 million, but Aerosmith wasn't the only band to incur representation. Metallica did as well with Guitar Hero, Metallica in 2009. Again, it represented the history of Metallica through all real-life venues that the band had played, but it did not include many of the band's lineup changes that occurred during the year, settling on the contemporary lineup, And because it came out during the era of World Tour, it included all the elements of that game, such as bass, drums, and vocals. If you pre-ordered the game, they even threw in a second kick pedal and trademarked drumsticks and stuff. 2 years later, Neversoft would choose Van Halen as the next major band to represent, but people didn't like it as much because progressively, the library went further down and down. This game had only 25 songs. Metallica had roughly 30-ish, and Aerosmith had almost 47. So all in all, they were dropping tracks. And people really didn't enjoy it all that much, citing that it sounded more like a glorified track pack than an actual Van Halen game.
Harmonix and Activision also created a few expansion games that were for the most part unsuccessful. Games such as Guitar Hero Encore Rocks the 80s, which expanded from Guitar Hero 2's mechanics and track lists, but again, people didn't like it. Then you had Guitar Hero Smash Hits, which just combined some of the best tracks from previous games, but it felt like it should have been more DLC. The only plus was that you could play certain songs from previous games with a full suite of instruments versus just a guitar, as in previous games. Then they created a spin-off called Band Hero, but nobody knew if it was a Rock Band or Guitar Hero game. Basically, it's a musical festival on a disc, but people tended to ignore it. After all, they had Guitar Hero 5 keeping them busy, and then they got sued by No Doubt. Then they had ports. For example, the On Tour series spawned 3 games and mobile entries that spawned 4 games. The DS version was weird. The controller was basically an add-on for the DS, and it was clunky. Other than that, they only had... Oh snap. Forgot about this one. It's time for some DJ Hero. Now, for the most part, home console music games involved the use of a guitar, as well as drums and vocals, but there wasn't a mainstream title out there that used the concept of DJing. This is where DJ Hero came in, sporting a handheld turntable that responded beautifully and had 3 buttons, a special effects knob, as well as a slider. It was a fantastic game that incorporated real-life DJs and spawned a sequel. Overall, the concept of Guitar Hero has somewhat been pushed in the ground, so much to where the consumers are moving on from the series and the overall genre itself. But never forget those late night parties where your friends were jamming out to some of the greatest songs ever made. Those memories are what matters more than anything.
Infocom wasn't the only player in the DOS game. Activision made themselves a few. That's right, developed and published by Activision, and this is one of those examples. Hacker was designed by Steve Cartwright and released in 1985 for pretty much every gaming computer known to mankind during the 80s, and features probably one of the more difficult puzzle schemes in a DOS game at the time. You play as a hacker controlling a robot who has to navigate dark tunnels and convince other agents to give up pieces of a secret document courtesy of bartering. With each different port, the items would be different, so it poses a unique challenge. There was a sequel in 1986's Hacker 2, The Doomsday Papers, which is practically the same game, but it's still worth a try. Also, don't forget, there was a time where Activision was known as Mediagenic, so that generated games such as Neuromancer, which is unrelated to this title, but still worth checking out. Heavy Gear. The next series we are going to talk about might be a familiar one, but before we get to that one, we need to cover this series that came out after that series was fading from popularity due to a licensing issue. But again, we'll get to that in a moment. Heavy Gear, which was released in 1997, is a vehicular combat game where you control armored robots, or mechs as you will. It was often considered a commercial failure. The sequel, Heavy Gear 2, was released 2 years later, but it was just as, if not more unsuccessful than the first entry. That's fine, because Lord Calebcom is here to tell us about the mech combat franchise that did kick ass. Take it away.
Thanks, Celia. I can talk for days, months, even years about this franchise. It had a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. But let's talk about it from the beginning. You had Activision, you had FASA. FASA being the company that owned the intellectual property, BattleTech. But we aren't here to get into the whole of BattleTech. Just know that FASA made 2 board games with BattleTech before creating an RPG called MechWarrior. It wasn't really streamlined yet, but the seed was planted. The first game would be Infocom's BattleTech The Crescent Hawk's Inception, which was an RPG and text strategy game that looks really good for its time. It had its own sequel called BattleTech The Crescent Hawk's Revenge, which for the most part was exclusively real-time strategy. We don't know exactly how, but Activision reached out to FOSSA to request permission to make MechWarrior as the game we know and love, and apparently got their blessing because MechWarrior was released for the PC in 1989. For the first time, we were able to control, in the way it's presented, a battle mech and have the free will in an RPG-styled game that had tons of action sequences neatly tucked within it. This is where it all began, and when I say there's levels to this game, there are levels to this game. If you ever play it, don't approach it like you would a contemporary MechWarrior game. This is its own experience and definitely worth checking out. Now, the MechWarrior we know and love in that style of first-person combat likely began with MechWarrior on the SNES and Genesis, released in 1993 and 1994 respectively. You play as Harris, whose family was killed by a group of evil guys called the Darkwing Lance. Your only job is to hunt them down, take them out. The next entry would be MechWarrior 3050, which was a drastically different game that was reminiscent of the original BattleTech game without the RPG elements. It's rather difficult with an isometric view and wonky learning curve, but once you manage to get comfortable with it, it's not that bad. Alright, it's time for MechWarrior 2. MechWarrior 2 is perhaps the starting point for the vast majority of people who know MechWarrior, myself included. It involves two clans of MechWarriors, Clan Wolf and Clan Jade Falcon, taking place during various battles during the Refusal Wars. With a total of 32 missions, ambient sound, and decent graphics for the time that moved pretty fast, this was the game to have on PC, which means expansion time. The first was Ghost Bear's Legacy, which added a few more levels and an entirely new clan, Clan Ghost Bear. Covers the events immediately after the Refusal War. There's a lot of lore to this series, so it's best that you play it yourself and learn the stories on your own time. Trust me, it'll be worth it. Another expansion called MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries was a prequel to MechWarrior 2, and many felt that it was kind of rushed. The AI was wonky, but people still enjoyed it. It was even awarded Space Simulation Game of the Year. From that point on, the games weren't made by Activision, but there's a ton of games in this series, and I strongly encourage you to play them. I personally love this series. I'm highly anticipating the release of MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries later this year.
Now, nothing screams Activision more than the era where they were a household name, the Atari 2600. For many of us, this was our first exposure to Activision. It all began with a 1982 Atari 2600 game called Pitfall. You play as Pitfall Harry and have to collect all the treasures in a jungle within 20 minutes, all the while jumping over pits, dodging obstacles, and a multitude of different enemies along the way. Treasures vary in point value from 2,000 to 5,000 points, with the coveted 114,000 points being reserved for only the best Pitfall players. From a stick figure running through a colorized adventure through the jungle, this game was without a doubt one of the greatest games available for the Atari 2600. It helped pave the way for Activision in the video game industry. It was ported to various consoles and computers such as the Atari 5200, Atari 8-bit console, ColecoVision, Intellivision, Apple II, MSX, and the Commodore 64. It seemed people just couldn't get enough of this simple, albeit fun game. The sequel, Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns, was essentially the same game, because it again was born on the Atari 2600. So outside of a few graphical and mechanical improvements, it was destined to be the same game, which essentially was true for most games created during this time period. Interestingly enough, it was released after the video game crash, and among all the multitudes of titles that were available in the market, this game was incredibly successful. Often referred to as one of the top 25 games ever created for the Atari 2600. There was an alternate version for the 8-bit and 5200 systems, but it only added a single new level, otherwise essentially the same.
Once the NES came to fruition, it was time for Activision to pony up. Literally, with the help of Pony Incorporated and Micronics to create Super Pitfall, an 8-bit spin on the game. But unfortunately, it didn't hold a candle to the Atari 2600's entries, and this one in particular is oftentimes considered one of the worst NES games out there, and that's saying a lot. It's a lot of trial and error, and in an NES game, that can make or break a deal. There was a sequel planned called Super Pitfall 2, which was canned, which is fine, because it was just going to be a rehash of Atlantis No Nazo. So, I guess we're lucky we missed that one. The true sequel came out would be called Pitfall, the Mayan adventure released in 1994, and is literally a direct sequel to the original 2600 entry. Basically, you play as Pitfall Harry Jr., and go off on a rescue mission to save your father, who is stranded in a Mayan jungle. It was a pretty cool game, and if you were lucky, you would find the Easter egg to play the original Pitfall. As the game was ported to various expansion consoles, such as the Sega CD and 32X, more levels were incorporated. Overall, it sold 1 million copies by 1996, and many people applaud it for having some of the smoothest animation ever in an SNES game. We wouldn't see another Pitfall game until 1998 for the PS1 and GBC, known as Pitfall 3D Beyond the Jungle. And if you ever paid any attention to any game ever in the 90s with the word 3D in it, you know exactly where this is going. This game was a bomb, not the good kind. It was clunky, had tank controls, and the camera was unreliable. People who were used to the older style of Pitfall games had literally no interest in this game expanding to the 3D realm, and it was quite obvious. The final entry would be Pitfall, the lost expedition for all consoles and PCs appropriate for the early 2000s, and it handled immensely better than the previous game. It plays like Crash Bandicoot and the graphics are adorable, and the soundtrack is fairly decent too. But unfortunately, this is likely the last time we'll ever see this IP, because the idea is just as retro as fuck, and that's where this game belongs, on the Atari 2600.
From all the other games that Activision made on the 2600, such as Barnstorming, where you flew a crop duster through barns, Fishing Derby, boxing, skiing, ice hockey, or tennis, none of them really had any follow-ups, except for one series, River Raid. River Raid is a top-down vertical shooter where you fly a jet over a river and take out objects that come floating down. As is the norm with many Atari games, the point was just to get as many points as possible. The sequel, River Raid 2, was just as successful and only changed minor details and ranked up the difficulty.
This is another case of Activision picking up an IP way late in the game. Spyro is for all accounts an Insomniac Games and Universal series. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to be talking about the Skylanders franchise that piggybacked onto Spyro after the concept had been beaten into ground. Basically, to play the game, you had to have a system, which is fine. Then you had to have a game, which is fine. That game came with a base that utilized NFC, or near field communication, to read data on little statues. Think of it as amiibos before amiibos were popular. Here's the catch. The Skylanders figurines for all the games aren't cheap. They're roughly $15 a piece. And if you were lucky, they were in a bundle. So if you wanted to collect them all, good luck. It's an expensive hobby for one title alone. Anyway, in terms of the games, the first was Skylanders Spyro's Adventure, which again was a kick in the dick for people who really enjoyed Spyro. Instead of a new Spyro game, we got toy statues that appealed to a much younger dynamic. With 32 characters, 3 of which came with the game, you're supposed to restore the Core of Light after it was destroyed by Chaos, who recently came out of retirement in the Outlands. Honestly, without the gimmicks, the game would have been solely that, and I doubt anyone would have complained. Kids loved it though. The sequel would be Skylanders Giants, which explains the history of the Skylines and how they came to be. Chaos, after being banished by Spyro, is literally in a toy store where he jumps on a portal of power. You know, the thing you put the statues on and goes back to Skylines, 10,000 years in the past. Speaking of giants, these toys were like 2 times the size of the previous statues. So that means more expensive collecting. Oh, and it doesn't even have Spyro in it, so why is this a Spyro game? The next game would be released in 2013 as Swap Force, and the basic premise was that you would take statues and mix and match them, creating different movesets and abilities, which I'm not gonna lie, is kinda cool. That's mixing and matching 2 core electronics, and the power pedestal recognizes it perfectly. I guess now would be a good time to explain that the Skylander statues have a major compatibility issue. You see, in Spyro's Adventure, you can only use those Skylanders, but you could use them in any other game. In Giants, some of the statues from Spyro's Adventure don't work. In Swap Force, most of the Skylanders from Spyro's Adventure and Giants do not work. In the next game, Trap Team, only one of the Skylanders from before worked. So with every release, you had to buy new statues to remotely enjoy the game. I don't know if this is a masterpiece at work for marketing or a scam, but either way, it's fucked. There would be 2 more releases in 2015 and 2016 known as Superchargers and Imaginators respectively. They also had 7 different mobile-based spin-offs.
Skateboarding can be fun, but you know what's even more fun? Not actually having to skateboard, especially if you don't know how to skateboard. That's where Tony Hawk's Pro Skater came in. It was a fun challenge for people who skated and those who didn't, all wrapped up in one fun game. The first title was released in 1999 and featured a real-life cast true to form skateboarders, including their signature styles, and had a banging soundtrack of ska and other forms of music that only social deviants like myself, who climb on roofs, would listen to. Throughout the levels, you would have specific challenges to find tapes, or fulfill conditions that would help you unlock tapes. No more, no less. A year later, we would have Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 added to the mix. And in this one, you could create your own skater. Instead of the linear design of the first one, you could do multiplayer, edit levels, career mode, or even a simple session, in addition to the free skate option. This game alone has one of the highest rating for most video games released, and was incredibly successful, setting the baseline for what was to be expected for the skateboarding video game simulation genre. If the PS1 entry is too plebby for you, then fear not. They did re-release the game as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X in 2001 as a launch title for the Xbox, but give the older one a try. A year later, it was time to jump, manual, and kickflip our way into the PS2's tray, and make a staple of our childhood known as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. This game streamlined everything possible with the franchise, and sold over 2.1 million copies, generating sales revenue of $77 million by 2006 alone. This is one of the rare games that has the distinct honor of being one of the highest rated games of all time, the other being Grand Theft Auto 3. The next game would be Numero Quattro. That's right, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, which introduced skitchin'. No, not that shitty Genesis game. The actual act of skating while holding onto a vehicle, which is very unsafe, children, don't do that. But it was another great addition to the family of skating games that propelled Neversoft to the forefront of video game development as we know it.
Then came Underground, which was released in 2003, which featured something a little bit different, a storyline. That's right, plot, but fear not, it wasn't handled poorly at all. You can still enjoy the pleasure of the format of the levels in all the previous games. They just added a little spice with a plot involving Eric Sparrow and the protagonist seeking to become famous skateboarders. They impressed Chad and Muska, a real-life professional skateboarder, and the rest you'll have to see for yourself. The game was simply phenomenal, and the levels we knew and loved were made significantly bigger, so exploring them is a must. It's considered to be one of the greatest contemporary skating games around, which likely led to the development of the next entry, Underground 2, featuring the same cast, with again a little spice if you watered it down. Underground 1 was far more successful than Underground 2, but we'll let you be the judge. There was a remake for the PSP called Underground 2 Remix, so if you like PSP gaming, this is one you definitely want in your library. The next game would be Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, which took everything we knew, put it in a box, shook it around, and boom, one major level with almost non-existent load times and access to sub-levels within the main overworld. This was a phenomenal thing for Activision to do, and they even accomplished adding BMX stunts in as well. But you have to steal some kid's bike to do it, so that's your call. There was a remake of this as well for the DS called Skateland, stylized with an 8, and if you want to go even more retro, there is a GBA version too, but don't expect the same graphic.
The 8th game in the series to be released was Project 8 in 2006, which involves Tony Hawk choosing 8 skaters to compete, and you start at the bottom of the totem pole and build yourself up. Imagine a better version of Skate, because in this game, you can get points for breaking bones. True story. Another unique aspect of this game was the ability for the camera to zoom into your feet, during which you could manually choose your trick and curtail it to your desired effect. The final main entry would be Tony Hawk's Proving Ground, which featured 9 levels spanning Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. It maintained the same open world approach and was appreciated the same way all the other ones were, but it wasn't as great. It would also be the last time Neversoft would touch the franchise before Robomoto took over. Robomoto made some major changes to the formula that were, for the most part, whack. It all started with Ride, which had a weird-ass skateboard that had lasers that would recognize if you jumped, tipped the board, or did anything. The issue was, it was done extremely poorly. Well, let's try to unfuck ourselves with Shred. Shit. Well, that was pretty much for the most part the nail in the coffin for the Tony Hawk series, and Neversoft isn't a thing anymore. So unless Infinity Ward has some trick up its sleeve, it's safe to say that this long-loved series has bailed out and did an Ollie Benihana into irrelevance. Since then, Robomoto did an HD remake of the first 3 games, which was a cool facelift, and went forward to make Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. But it was apparent by now that Robomoto had zero clue how to make a fucking skateboarding game. And this one is considered to be one of the worst games of all time. It was glitchy, the frame rate sucked, it wasn't unique, it was bad. Oh, and it required online server access to play. So guess what? You can't even play it anymore. Sucks to be us, I guess. Going back, there were a few other games released, such as Downhill Jam, where you could bomb hills and stuff. And then Motion for the DS was released, but it was shit. And then Shred Session, which was cancelled, that turned into Skate Jam, which is a phone game. It's been a good long ride, but it's time to wrap it up. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater will always be a part of our history as gamers. And while we can't name a single singer from the soundtracks, we can revel in the fact that we might be able to sing along with them.
The final franchise we will be talking about today is True Crime, which was a Luxoflux game created in 2003. The full title is True Crime: Streets of LA, and it's a really good game if you get a chance to play it. You play as Detective Nick Kang, who is investigating terrorist attacks in Chinatown. And throughout the story, you discover a criminal underworld, and yeah, it's a plot meant for the PS2. It includes the ability to be a police officer and do things police officers would do, such as respond to emergencies, frisk people for weapons and drugs, and obviously do the storyline missions as all GTA clones tend to do. The kicker though was, for the first time in a long time, the player was doing an anti-GTA sort of perspective, one that wouldn't be touched again until Rockstar's LA Noire many years later. Streets of LA was massively successful, selling 65 million in sales by 2006. Since then, 3 million units have been sold. The sequel, however, Streets of New York, was subpar. This time you play as a gang member turned police officer, and that would be fine and dandy if it wasn't riddled with glitches and technical issues that sometimes render the game unplayable. It is 100% a GTA clone, and this was seen as a commercial failure. It was just a rush game that likely would have been fantastic if it only had been given the time to be developed the right way. The next game was supposed to be True Crime: Streets of Hong Kong, but Activision abandoned the IP after poor sales of Streets of New York, so because of that, Square Enix grabbed up the shell of the game, or at least the idea, and released a game known as Sleeping Dogs, which is an amazing game, and we strongly encourage you to play it.
Well, that was a great episode. Thank you so much, Ace, Cilia, as well as Sick Jake, Lord Knight Caleb Com, as well as Tesseract E for coming out and telling us a little bit about Activision. Now, the next episode clearly has to be about this company. But because this company has something to do with this company, we're going to talk about this company. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the next episode's gonna be fucking badass. And I know exactly who I want to talk about it. It's gonna be Purse, the DOS Nerd, and myself. And I'm sure we'll find some more guest speakers as we go along, but I'm really, really excited. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode. From my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Ready to Go Gaming Show, out.